trick or treat, give me something good to eat. If I don't.
My family didn't celebrate Halloween. Pause, that's a bit of an understatement. My father believed that October 31st was Satan's birthday, and anything that resembled fun which occurred on that day would glorify evil. Kids who showed up to the door looking for candy were given chick tracts or told that they were going to hell. Our yard was toilet papered and egged every year. It wasn't that we went to a particularly fundamentalist church either. Every year the youth group would have a treat chest and a huge party on that day. I never got to attend that party. Dad was of the opinion that the youth pastor was an agent of the devil. My mother didn't really talk about it. I asked her one year if I could go to the church service and youth party, and all she said was, "I'll pretend I didn't hear that. You know how your father gets this time of the year." By 15 years old, I was convinced my father was mentally ill. After 15 November smelling rotten eggs outside my bedroom, I decided I had enough. I'd saved my allowance for a few weeks, and when my mom was buying groceries at the local IGA, I was across the street buying a ghost face mask. I tucked it into my jacket and kept it hidden until I got home. After stashing it in the back of my closet in a box where I kept my fireworks and a wrinkled porno mag, I went downstairs to do my chores. I had every intention of sneaking out on Halloween and egging half of the neighborhood in revenge for all of those times I retched at the smell on our roof. That isn't how it worked out. On the 31st of October, my father decided to search my room. A friend of his had seen me at the party store buying the mask. He ransacked my room when he found the Halloween mask next to the fireworks and a porno magazine. I heard him yelling from down in the basement. After listening to my father rant incoherently for about 10 minutes, I snapped out of daydreaming when he said, "No boy of mine is going to burn for the sins of devil worship and onanism." Before I had any real time to react, I caught sight of his belt swinging towards my face. I threw up my arms in vain, but the rough leather tore across my forehead and left behind a stinging sensation followed by a dull thud. The impact of his thick belt on my face had knocked my head into the wall behind me. My knees went wobbly as the room dimmed. Tiny pinholes of bright light came in and out of the darkness that filled my vision. Dazed, but not unconscious, I fell to the floor. I pushed myself up on my hands, but my dad wasn't done. The belt came again and again. With each strike, I felt the same sting followed by a throbbing pain. Each time I tried to stand or crawl away, the whipping became more frequent. My mind tried to wander, but each strike brought me back to the painful reality that my dad had finally lost it. My mother was screaming. My little sister was crying. I tried one last time to stand, but the belt smacked me in the back of my head. My arms fell out from under me and landed face first on a tile. The world faded to black. It could have been a few minutes and it could have been an hour. I don't know for sure. Every inch of my body ached. My shoulder was dislocated and I had a huge gash on the side of my head. I was on the basement floor and the muck around the drain had lodged in my head wound. Everything I could feel alternated between stinging and feeling like I was being stabbed. I stumbled over to the shop sink and tried to wash myself off. There was no mirror, but I can only imagine what I looked like. I could hear muffled yelling upstairs. I didn't want to think about how I'd wound up at the foot of the stairs, but wouldn't have taken a rocket scientist to figure it out. I moved up the stairs slowly and quietly. Each step reminded me of the pain in my knee that hadn't been there before. I had been roughed up pretty badly. To this day, I don't know how or why I survived. I was standing on the other side of the door to the upstairs, and I heard my mom shout, "James is dead! I don't care about Jesus or God or the devil. You killed our son. I heard the sound. The best approximation that I could give you is that it sounded like a baseball hitting a burrito. My mother wasn't shouting anymore. I heard my father shout, "God damn it!" In my 15 years of life, I had heard my father take the Lord's name in vain exactly 0 times. The man didn't cuss. He didn't even use substitute words like fudge or heck. I had never heard the man use a curse word in my whole life, and at that moment, I was standing on the other side of the door repeating the words, God damn it," over and over again. Heavy footsteps pounded out of the kitchen, and I stood there for a moment in silence as I tried to work up the courage to open the door. My father was a tall man with a stocky build. Part of the reason I never rebelled up to that point was out of fear or reverence for his size. I pushed the door open slowly and fell to my knees in horror. My mother's body was slumped over in the corner next to a bloody rolling pin. Her blood pooled on the floor. Her eyes stared right at me but didn't blink. Her lifeless eyes were the centerpiece of a look of shock that is burnt into my mind now as vividly as when I saw it then. My father's heavy footsteps were stomping around the upstairs, and my mother was dead. I tried to pull open the back door, but the knob wouldn't turn. I shook the doorknob frantically, but it had no effect. I turned towards the hallway and slowly made my way to the front door. My legs were as sore as the rest of my body. I didn't walk so much as I shambled. I had very little in the way of balance or coordination. It was no surprise that I bumped into the lampshade on the living room end table. My heart nearly stopped as it fell to 3 feet through air and onto the floor. The glass shattered on the floor with a loud crash. My father's footsteps shuffled quickly as he approached the stairs. I half expected to see him barrel down the stairs, but instead, I looked on in horror as my sister's crumpled body was thrown to the bottom of the stairs. It looked like he had folded her in half. Her expression was one of sadness and terror. I couldn't help but retch at the sight of it. As my father's heavy footfalls lumbered down the stairs, I lost my stomach contents to the floor. Tears streamed from my eyes as I dry heaved. A sharp pain formed on the side of my chest as I flew back. My dad's size 14 boot connected with my ribs, and I bounced off of the door frame before hitting the floor. His slurred speech formed the words, "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" When a kick throws you across the room, vowels are easier than words. I moaned, "Eh." My father sat on the end table. As I stumbled to my feet, he pulled a long swig from a bottle of whiskey that I found more confusing than surprising. His slurred speech made sense for as much as my brain could process that he was drinking. The city had tried to pass a motion to legalize the sale of liquor by the drink, and his response was to protest with a sign in the court square. Looking back, it makes sense, sort of. Even still, I couldn't help but nod as he shoved the bottle in my face and said, "Have a shot with your old man." I was too afraid to say no. The brown liquid burned as I gulped it down. As terrible as it tasted and uncomfortable as it felt, at least it eased the pain a little. I sat there staring at the bottle for a moment and heard my father say, "Pass it back or finish it." I handed him the bottle and he killed it on a long chug. He flicked his wrist and the bottle flew from his hand and against the wall. Glass shattered and peppered the floor. He looked over at me and said, "My old man used to drink with me. That bastard would put cigarettes out in my arm when he got bored. It was about this time 26 years ago when I burnt the house down around him and swore that I'd never touch the stuff again. You ruined that." I tried to speak, but only gibberish in the form of a mumble could leave my lips. Dad slid down into the floor across from me and said, "I slipped up once, or twice, Hell, I bought this bottle 3 years ago when your sister was born, and the doctor said she might not make it. He stared off into the distance for a moment only to snap back with, but I didn't even open it. I put it up on a shelf and prayed that your sister would live, and she did. I spoke up. How's this my fault? Dad picked up the end table and chucked it all the way over to my head. Splinters of broken wood and chunks of the end table fell on my head as he screamed, "You just had to buy that goddamn mess! Now we're damned!" I tried to respond, but he just continued, "Your mother blasphemed before I killed her. Your sister was under the age of innocence, so she clearly went to heaven. You were supposed to be dead. 17 years of marriage lost when that woman blasphemed in my face about you being dead and you had to be alive. I'll fix that for you." The 40-year-old man sprung to his feet like a teenager and grabbed me by the ankle. The next few moments were a blur. I vaguely remember being yanked across the living room and into the front yard. My head bounced off of the front step and my world went hazy again. The world began to spin. Between the whiskey and the pain, I had lost all sense of time or reality. My mind slipped in and out of the fantasy where I'd wake up at any moment and everything would be fine. Dad made sure to crush that as he dragged me around to the backyard. I lay there completely unable to move as he rummaged through the shed. He returned a moment later with a shovel. He frantically pulled soil from the earth and flung it in my general direction. When he had dug far enough down to satisfy his psychosis, the shovel was thrown over me. His massive hands grabbed me by the neck and pulled me into the makeshift grave. My body was too damaged. If I was conscious at all, it was by sheer luck. I'd long since lost the will to live. Everything about my life ceased to make any sense at the sight of my dead mother, and even more so upon seeing my poor sister at the foot of the stairs. My father stopped for a moment and said, "I'll see you in hell, son. We're all damned now." I closed my eyes and waited for death. Death must have been distracted. A moment later, I heard a loud voice say, "Step away from that boy and put your hands over your head." I heard my father scream incoherently as he ran from my field of vision. Gunshots rang in my ears as the light faded from my eyes one last time. I succumbed to the pain and drifted off toward the empty blackness. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't see my mom or sister. My eyes closed and stayed that way for a week. I woke up in the hospital with a tube up my nose and another down my throat. Altogether, I had more than 1,000 stitches, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured hip. I was lucky. Neither my mother or sister had survived. The police emptied the better part of the 20 bullets into my father, and even after they emptied their magazines, he crawled towards them. After another couple of days of observation, I was released to a foster family. I stayed with them until I turned 18. Since then, I haven't really looked back. I don't celebrate Halloween. You won't find any pumpkins on my porch, and trick-or-treaters are met with a sign that reads, "Go the fuck away." It's been 17 years and I still walk with a limp. Needless to say, I don't go to church. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Every year I'd decorate the outside of the house, carve at least 2 jack-o'-lanterns, and buy loads of candy to hand out to the trick-or-treaters that came to my door. I'm pretty sure I'd had just as much fun as any of the kids who dressed up and happily went door to door. As much as I used to love it, I won't be participating anymore after last year. It was shortly after 9:30 p.m., a little more than half an hour after my town scheduled trick-or-treating came to a close. My porch light was off, the candles inside the pumpkins were blown out, and I had just sat down to watch a horror movie on TV. I wasn't too surprised when the doorbell rang. I was pretty well known among the neighborhood kids for buying too much candy, and it wasn't unusual for a few to stop at my house on the way home to see if I would add more candy to their heavy pillowcases. I paused the movie, grabbed a bowl of candy, and opened the door. The first thing that went through my head was that this kid's costume was fucking amazing. His mask looked like it was a large weathered goat skull with huge horns that spiraled up and around until a point came close to touching his shoulders. I wondered how he could see through the lights in the eye holes that glowed red. He wore a black robe that was so big on him that it bunched on the ground at his feet and completely covered his hands. I would have been a bit more freaked out immediately if I hadn't stood about a foot taller than him. After appreciating his costume for a moment, I opened the screen door and presented the bowl of candy while telling him how much I loved his costume. His whole head tilted down to gaze at the treats for a moment before he looked right at me. I started to feel a little freaked out at this point. This kid hasn't said a word, and I had a feeling like he was staring through me. We stared at each other for close to a minute before I let out a nervous chuckle. Alright kid, you got me. The costume's great, but I have a movie waiting for me in here that I really want to watch, so take some candy and go visit Mrs. Thompson down the street. I bet you'll make her piss her pants with that act. He didn't even look at the bowl as I pushed it toward him. He looked me straight in the eye as he took a step forward and knocked it to the ground. I started to reach for the bowl and spew profanity, but before I could do either one, the kid reached out and grabbed my arm. That's when I realized it wasn't a kid. The hand tightly grasping my bicep was rotting. Cracked brown nails, tipped gray wrinkled fingers attached to a hand with oozing sores so deep that I could see bone. I wrenched my arm out of its grasp and scurried back through the door into my house, slamming it as the thing rushed forward and turning the dead bolt. It started pounding on the door so hard that it shook the frame, and I feared the wood would splinter as I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed 911.
Hello?
The operator reassured me that the officers were on their way and was telling me that she would stay on the line with me until they got there when the pounding stopped. My heart was pounding. I went to the window and used my sweat-covered shaking hand to pull down a blind just enough to peek outside. It stood in my front yard, staring at the house with eyes that glowed and pulsed like fire. The thing was no longer the size of a child. It was now almost half as tall as a utility pole on the edge of the yard. I backed away from the window and told the operator where it had moved to and what it was doing. She informed me that the police would be there in a few minutes. I stared at the blinds while I waited, painfully aware of what stood on the other side and terrified that it wouldn't stay there. I heard what sounded like strong wind howling outside, and the house began to shake. The lights flickered as pictures fell off of the wall and the books off of the shelves. The windows exploded with such force that the blinds were ripped from the wall and shards of glass flew through the room. I screamed as I dove to the floor, lifting my arm to protect my face. I scrambled to the couch and sat behind it. It didn't offer much protection, but it was better than nothing. It suddenly became stifling hot in my living room. The putrid smell of death filled the air, and I gagged as I tried to tell the 911 operator what was happening. Sweat poured off of my forehead, and my shirt quickly became soaked. I felt exhausted all of a sudden, like I hadn't slept in months. Whispers filled my ears as I struggled to keep my eyes open. They told me horrible things, how they would rip my organs from my body one by one, that they would pull my eyes from the sockets and devour them like grapes, the vile ways they would violate my body before death turned it cold. I dropped the phone to the floor and covered my ears, desperate to block out the voices, but it was no use. They grew louder and louder until whispers turned to screams. All I wanted to do was drift to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw grotesque images. I witnessed children ripped limb from limb, A woman tied to a table while a bear-like creature penetrated her with a long knife. A man's skin blistered and melt away as he burnt into nothing. Despite their overwhelming desire to close, I forced my eyes open. I wept as I held my hands so tightly over my ears that my head began to throb. The voices were no longer speaking, but had devolved into screams. My skin felt so hot that I was surprised it hadn't begun to blister. I forced myself to stand and started making my way to the back door. My body felt 100 pounds heavier, making it hard to move my feet that were heavier than cinder blocks. I had just made it to the doorway between the living room and the kitchen when I had an overwhelming desire to turn around. Leaning against the doorway, I looked behind me. The thing was standing at the open window, bent over with its decaying hands resting on the sill. A long, thick tongue lolled from its open mouth, and blood slowly dripped from the tip. Although the face was bone, it seemed like it was smiling. Its eyes burned into me as a deep chuckle joined the chorus of screams. I began walking toward it, against my will. I tried to stop, but something was pulling me along. As I passed the couch, I grabbed it and held with all of my strength. I dug my nails into the fabric and screamed so hard that I felt something pop in my throat. My own legs tried to move towards certain death while my upper body fought for my life. The upholstery began ripping beneath my fingers and the couch slowly slid along the floor. My hands and arms arched at the effort. I let out a desperate yell as my fingers lost the battle and now once again began approaching my attacker. No matter how hard I willed my legs to stop moving, they took step after step until I reached the window. I stood mere inches away from this monster, trying my damnedest not to look at his face. He reached across the space between us, touching his foul-smelling hand on my chin and forcing me to meet its gaze. As its eyes met mine, all of the bad went away. The putrid smell, the blistering heat, the deafening screams, even the fear slipped away. I was no longer afraid that I was about to die. I knew this thing was going to kill me, and I was okay with it. The creature removed its hand from my face and stood straight. I stood there, mesmerized by it, unable to move even if I had wanted to. It opened its robes, revealing dozens of tortured faces pressing out from the skin of its chest and stomach. Their eyes were shut tight, and their mouths were open as wide as possible in expressions of agony and terror. They were silently screaming. My content feeling disappeared in an instant as the thing's hand grasped the back of my head and began pulling me toward the faces in its belly. I tried to pull away, fighting against its grip. I put my hands against the window frame and pushed myself away from it. The creature placed its other hand on the back of my head as well, interlocking its fingers on top of my short hair. I shut my eyes and put my foot on the wall beneath the window, putting all of my strength into getting away from the faces that were writhing beneath its skin. Just as I thought I was going to lose the battle, its grip broke and I fell to the floor. The monster let out a frustrated howl and moved away from the window. I sat on the floor amidst pieces of glass and knocked over possessions and prayed that help would come soon. I didn't know what the police could do against something like this, but just the thought that they were coming brought me some sort of hope. Just as I started wondering how long it would take for the cops to arrive, I heard a blood-curdling scream come from outside. I jumped to my feet and looked through the window, keeping my distance in case this was another trick to get me close enough to grab. The creature was back in the middle of my yard, holding a woman by the back of her neck while examining a small dog that was held in its other hand. I could hear the woman pleading with it, begging it to let her go. It threw the dog, which landed against my car in the driveway with a sickening thump and didn't move, then quickly pushed the woman into its stomach. I screamed as I watched it absorb her entire body, head to toe. Once she was gone, A new face joined the others that pressed outward as if it was trying to escape their prison. It turned to me then, watching me intently as it closed the front of its robes. I sank to the floor and leaned against the couch once more. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. I ran my fingers through my hair, stopping at my temples and gripping the strands as if that would help hold on to my sanity. I stayed there in that position, staring at the broken window where I was sure I would see my doom come for me once again. I don't know how long I sat there, but I was snapped out of a daze by a knock on the door. I rose to my feet and answered it, carefully peering through the peephole to make sure it was the police before doing so. The officer was saying something, but I didn't hear it. I was too busy staring at the circle of flames that was burning to the ground on my front yard, and the scorched earth that filled the center. That was where the black robe lay in a crumbled heap, with the goat skull mask sitting on top.